The Zelvar broadcast reached every human colony, every military outpost, and every warship still standing. High Marshal Vrakov stood before his assembled legion, a towering figure clad in ornate battle armor, his mandibles clicking in amusement as he addressed the galaxy. His words dripped with scorn. Humanity was weak, a species of prey creatures who cowered behind technology, who lacked the will to stand against a true warrior race. They had been given a chance to surrender, yet they still clung to resistance. It was laughable. He extended a challenge, not in the spirit of honor, but as a demonstration of inevitability. If humanity had any warriors worthy of the name, they would send their greatest champion. Not an army, not a fleet, just one. One human to stand against the might of the Dominion. And when that warrior fell, humanity's delusions of strength would fall with them. United Earth Command received the transmission in silence. It wasn't the first time humanity had been underestimated. It likely wouldn't be the last. The Dominion had already crushed 3 human colonies, reducing millions to ash with cold efficiency. They fought without hesitation, without remorse. But they didn't understand humanity. Not yet. They thought war was about overwhelming force, about numbers and firepower. But humans had never won wars that way. They won by outthinking their enemies, by adapting, by becoming something their opponents feared before they even understood why. They didn't send a diplomat. They didn't send a special forces team. They sent Captain Alexandra Hayes. Alex didn't care about the theatrics of war. She had no interest in speeches, in propaganda, in making a statement. She had fought the Zelvar before, and she had watched them butcher civilians like livestock, laughing in their guttural language as they executed wounded prisoners for sport. She didn't need a reason to take the fight to them. She just needed a target. The drop was silent. No grand entrance, no blaring alarms. The Dominion expected an arrival of significance, a landing pod, a military escort, something befitting a warrior's last stand. Instead, she slipped into their world unnoticed, buried in the wreckage of a ruined transport they had downed weeks ago. The Zelvar hadn't even bothered to check for survivors. She moved quickly, assessing the terrain. The Dominion's forward base sprawled across the valley, a fortress of alien metal and shifting energy barriers. Patrols moved in disciplined patterns, drones scanning the perimeter, their security built on arrogance. They didn't expect an infiltration because they didn't believe infiltration was possible. That was their first mistake. She watched them for hours, learning their habits. Zelvar warriors marched in tight formations, their movements precise but predictable. Their sentries relied on scanners more than their own senses. Their technology made them complacent. She used that. She avoided open ground, moved through shadows, let the wind cover the whisper of her steps. When she struck, it wasn't with a dramatic battle cry or a blaze of gunfire. It was silent, precise. The first sentry never even saw her. A single suppressed shot severed the link between his nervous system and his brain. The second fell in the same breath. No alarms, no panic. The Dominion prided itself on discipline, but discipline was a brittle thing when fear set in. And fear was something Alex understood better than they ever could. She wasn't here to fight them in open battle. That was what they expected, what they wanted. She was here to unmake them, to turn their own arrogance into a weapon. The Zelvar called humanity weak because they didn't understand what it meant to be human. They thought warriors were born, that strength was something inherent. But strength wasn't in blood. It was in choice, in will. And Alex had spent a lifetime making the choice to keep fighting, to survive when others would have fallen. She sabotaged their supply lines first. Not with explosives or crude destruction, but with precision. A cut in the wrong conduit, a delayed transmission, a single missing ration pack. Small things, insignificant things, until they weren't. Until the wrong squad went without ammunition at the worst possible moment, until orders arrived a fraction too late, until hunger made soldiers reckless. The Dominion still didn't realize what was happening. Their reports spoke of ghosts, of equipment failures, of bad luck. Alex let them believe that. She let them make excuses, let them convince themselves that nothing was truly wrong. And then, when they had settled back into routine, she struck again. A patrol disappeared. Not killed in battle. Not torn apart in some glorious struggle. Just gone. Weapons left behind, communication devices silent. One moment they existed, the next they didn't. The Zelvar found no bodies, no blood, no signs of conflict. Their commanders barked orders, demanding explanations. There were none, because that was the point. Fear crept into the ranks. Whispers spread. Warriors who had never hesitated before now glanced over their shoulders. The Zelvar were apex predators. They ruled through intimidation. But intimidation was a two-edged blade, and Alex had just turned it against them. It wasn't long before they started making mistakes. A squad fired at shadows, hitting nothing but air. A sentry abandoned his post, vanishing into the night. A commander, desperate to restore control, ordered his troops to march in larger formations, thinking that numbers would make them safe. It only made them easier to track. High Marshal Vrokov received the reports with simmering irritation. He dismissed them as cowardice, as failures of discipline. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in numbers, in raw, unyielding power. He doubled the patrols, ordered orbital scans, demanded results. Alex was already ahead of him. She didn't wait for them to adjust. She moved before they could react, pressing harder, striking deeper. She left messages behind now, not human words, but their own symbols carved into the metal walls of their barracks. Warnings meant for prey animals. By the time the Dominion truly understood the threat, it was too late to stop her. Their fortress wasn't a stronghold anymore. It was a cage, and they weren't hunters. They were trapped inside with something they didn't understand, something they couldn't fight. High Marshal Vrokov, for the first time in his long and decorated career, felt something unfamiliar curling at the edges of his thoughts. It was not rage, not frustration, something colder, something dangerously close to fear. High Marshal Vrokov did not believe in ghosts. He had crushed 100 species under the Dominion's banner, razed entire civilizations to the ground, and silenced rebellion with ruthless efficiency. Fear was a weapon he wielded with precision, breaking the will of lesser beings before they could even think to resist. But now, for the first time in his long and decorated career, he found his own warriors looking over their shoulders, hesitating before stepping into the darkness. He dismissed their weakness with contempt, but he could not ignore the reports piling on his desk. Squads vanishing without a trace. Supply lines disrupted without a single alarm triggered. His warriors, trained from birth for war, whispering about an unseen predator. This was not the battle he had prepared for. The human was not meeting them in the field, was not offering an honorable death. She was hunting them like vermin, and for the first time in Zelvar history, warriors were becoming prey. Captain Alexandra Hayes did not stop. The moment the Dominion began tightening their security, she adapted. They increased their patrols, she made them afraid to march. They reinforced their command posts. She turned their fortifications into their own tombs. They sent scouts to find her. None returned. She had no reinforcements, no supply drops, no way off this rock. But she didn't need them. The Zelvar were giving her everything she required. Their own fear was more valuable than any weapon, and she wielded it like a scalpel. She tracked their movements, learning how they adjusted, how they adapted. Their first mistake had been underestimating her. Their second was thinking they could outmaneuver her. The Dominion did not fight like humans. They relied on rigid formations, centralized command, and overwhelming firepower. But when that structure was disrupted, they floundered. Alex didn't just attack them, she dismantled them, piece by piece. A new commander arrived to restore order, a veteran of dozens of planetary campaigns. He implemented new countermeasures, motion sensors, aerial surveillance, hound-like drones that tracked heat signatures. On any other battlefield, it might have worked. But Alex was already 5 steps ahead. She understood how the Dominion thought, how they operated. They believed technology was the answer to all problems, that superior firepower would crush any resistance. That was why they always lost when the battle wasn't on their terms. She used their own systems against them. Motion sensors were disabled before they could be deployed. Surveillance drones were hijacked, turned into misdirection tools, sending false signals that had entire squads chasing phantoms in the dark. The hounds were formidable, relentless, built for the sole purpose of tracking, but they were machines. Machines could be deceived. Heat signatures could be altered. Traps could be set. The hounds did not last long. The Zelvar were growing desperate. They had expected a simple execution. A lone human should have been an afterthought, a footnote in their conquest of Earth's outer colonies. Instead, she had dragged them into a fight they did not understand, a war of attrition they were never meant to wage. Vrakov raged at the incompetence of his subordinates, but beneath his fury was something colder. Doubt. He had dismissed humanity's so-called resilience as mere stubbornness, their survival as luck rather than skill. Now, he was beginning to question his certainty. He had seen worlds burn, had watched entire species kneel before the Dominion's might. But never had he encountered an enemy that refused to fight on his terms. He issued a new order. No more patrols. No more hunting parties. He would not play this human's game. Instead, he withdrew his forces into the fortress, reinforcing the walls, sealing the gates. Let her come for them. Let her try to break through. Alex watched the change in strategy with amusement. They were scared. Hiding. She could feel it in the way their movements slowed, in the way their watchtowers scanned the horizon with increasing paranoia. They thought they were making the battlefield smaller, controlling the engagement. They thought they were trapping her. She let them believe it. She spent days letting them settle in, watching as their nerves frayed. Without patrols, they had no idea where she was, no information to rely on. The uncertainty alone was a weapon. They didn't sleep. They didn't speak as loudly. They twitched at every flickering light, every gust of wind. Then, she began taking the fortress apart. Not with brute force. That was the Dominion's way, not hers. She found the weak points, overlooked ventilation shafts, blind spots in their security grids, buried cables that carried power to the automated defenses. She sabotaged incrementally, carefully, never enough to raise alarms immediately. The first blackout lasted only seconds. A flicker in the lights, barely enough to be noticed. The second lasted a full minute. Systems rebooting. Confused operators scrambling for explanations. By the third, panic set in. When the walls finally failed, it wasn't with an explosion. It wasn't with an assault. It was with silence. The main gate controls shut down without warning. Emergency lockdown procedures failed. Communications jammed. And then, in the dead of night, the fortress fell into absolute darkness. The Zelvar had never known fear like this. Warriors trained to fight in coordinated assaults, to march with discipline under their High Marshal's banner, now found themselves blind and leaderless. They clutched their weapons in shaking hands, their keen eyesight useless in the pitch-black corridors. The sounds of movement echoed all around them, whispers of footsteps, the faint scratch of metal against stone. Some fired blindly. Some ran. None of it mattered. Alex moved through the chaos like a phantom. A knife in the dark. A shadow that whispered death into the ears of those who had called her species weak. The fortress was no longer their stronghold. It was her hunting ground. The Zelvar had sealed themselves inside, thinking they could wait her out, thinking they could turn the tide if they held firm. But they had only given her exactly what she wanted. By the time the emergency lights flickered back to life, the damage was done. The fortress was broken. Dozens of warriors lay unmoving, their weapons unfired, their throats slit before they even had the chance to scream. The survivors huddled together, backs pressed against cold walls, waiting for an attack that never came. Vrakov stood at the center of it all, his mandibles clenched in fury. He had led entire campaigns without failure. He had never lost a war. And yet here, against one human, he was losing everything. His warriors no longer looked to him for strength. They looked to him for answers. He had none. And then a single message appeared on the command console, written in the Dominion's own war language. You were right about one thing, Marshal. I am alone, but you're the one who should be afraid. The Zelvar, for the first time in their history, understood what it was to be hunted. Vrakov stood in the command chamber of his shattered fortress, staring at the screen that pulsed with that single, taunting message. He could feel the weight of his warriors' gazes pressing into his back, their silent accusations thick in the stale, blood-scented air. The great High Marshal of the Dominion had led them into a war against a single human, and now the very foundation of their military doctrine was crumbling beneath them. Warriors who had once stormed battlefields without hesitation now hesitated before rounding a corner. Officers who had commanded fleets now whispered among themselves, their rigid discipline unraveling into something dangerously close to fear. He would not stand for it. With a snarl, he turned, mandibles clicking with cold fury. Enough! His voice cut through the stagnant silence, forcing every soldier in the room to stand at attention, though none dared meet his gaze. You shame the Dominion with your cowardice. She is one human. One. He slammed a fist against the nearest console, shattering the surface. If you fear a lone predator, then you are unworthy of the title warrior. The words rang hollow even to himself. This wasn't just any enemy. This was something else. Something he could not define, but he would not let it fester. He had underestimated the human's tactics, but he would not make that mistake again. If she thrived in the shadows, he would strip them away. If she fed off their uncertainty, he would give them order. He issued new commands. Every available energy cell was rerouted to external floodlights. Every tunnel, every corridor, every open crevice would be bathed in artificial daylight, eliminating the darkness she had used as a weapon. Sound sensors were calibrated to detect even the subtlest of movements. The remaining warriors would no longer move in squads but in locked phalanxes, backs to one another, overlapping fields of fire, shields raised at all times. No more patrols. No more small engagements. She would be given no more opportunities to strike from the shadows. She would be lured into the open, where Dominion firepower reigned supreme. Alex watched them adjust, analyzing every change in real time. She perched atop the remains of a ruined outpost, unseen by the aerial patrols that now scoured the landscape with unrelenting precision. Vrokov was learning. He had finally begun treating her as more than just an anomaly, and that meant he was becoming dangerous. Not because he could defeat her, but because he was getting desperate. Desperation made creatures unpredictable, and unpredictability was a problem. She adjusted in kind. Where before she had struck from the darkness, now she would make them believe she was everywhere at once. She played with their paranoia, using their own sensors against them. She found ways to trigger false alarms, making it seem as if multiple attackers were converging from different angles. She manipulated their drones, creating ghost signals that sent entire squadrons sprinting toward empty corridors. They never knew when the attack would come, or if it ever would. But despite all her advantages, despite all her experience, the new changes made things harder. Every move required twice the effort, every mistake had twice the consequence. She had once danced between their blind spots, but now there were fewer of them, and she could feel the walls closing in. Then the Dominion changed the game again. She spotted the transport from a distance, a bulky, armored carrier descending into the heart of the fortress. It was a model she recognized, one she had seen before in war footage from other human colonies that had fallen to the Dominion. It did not carry reinforcements. It carried something worse. Enforcers. She cursed under her breath, retreating from her vantage point before she was detected. If the Dominion were sending enforcers, then they had truly abandoned all pretense of treating this as a normal engagement. Enforcers were not mere soldiers. They were executioners, beings bred for singular purpose, annihilation. They did not hesitate, they did not falter, and they did not fear. They did not need light or formation tactics. They hunted the way she did, and they were here for her. The first enforcer made its move before the sun had even set. She caught its approach only because of the way the surrounding wildlife had gone silent, the shift in atmosphere that her instincts picked up before her sensors did. It was fast. Unnaturally fast. Unlike the rest of the Dominion forces, it did not stomp or march. It glided, a silent shadow that closed distances with terrifying efficiency. She barely avoided its first strike. A razor-edged gauntlet tore through the tree she had been using for cover, splintering it into shards of wood and fiber. She moved, rolling into a firing position, pulling the trigger the second her rifle aligned with the target. The round struck true, but the enforcer barely flinched. She did not fire again. She moved. The enforcer pursued without hesitation, adjusting mid-stride, calculating her movements in real time. Its reflexes were inhuman, its body reinforced with layers of cybernetic augmentations. It was not like the Dominion warriors she had faced before. It did not hesitate. It did not react emotionally. It only adapted. She ran the calculations in her head even as she moved. It was stronger, faster, likely had enhanced targeting, enhanced tracking. Its armor was built to withstand direct ballistic impacts. But it had weaknesses. It was relying on its speed, which meant it expected its prey to run. It was predicting movement patterns, adapting to her evasions in real time. She changed tactics. She stopped. The enforcer's momentum betrayed it. It had calculated for continued movement, had expected a chase. Instead, she twisted into a stationary firing stance, taking the fraction of a second she needed to line up the shot properly. The bullet struck just beneath the reinforced plating of its jaw, where cybernetics met organic tissue. The enforcer collapsed mid-stride, momentum sending it skidding lifelessly across the dirt. She exhaled. One down. But there would be more. Vrokov received the report with grim satisfaction. The first enforcer had been lost, but it had gathered data before it fell. It had forced the human into direct engagement. And now the others would adjust. She had survived longer than he anticipated. That only meant her death would be more satisfying. He watched the live feed from the remaining enforcers, tracking their movements as they spread through the terrain like a pack of apex predators. They moved differently than his soldiers. They did not require orders, did not question their purpose. They would not stop until the human was dead. She had survived the Dominion's army. She had even survived the first enforcer. But she would not survive them all. The battlefield had changed. The Dominion had abandoned its reliance on overwhelming numbers and brute force. Now it moved with precision, its warriors reduced to little more than sentries, while the enforcers hunted with relentless efficiency. Alex had studied them, watched how they moved, how they tracked, how they adjusted. They learned faster than the rank-and-file soldiers. They didn't waste time searching where she wasn't. They read the terrain like predators, seeking the path of least resistance, predicting her movements before she made them. She had to stop thinking of them as soldiers. They weren't. They were something else, something closer to her. She was running out of space to maneuver. The fortress was no longer a maze of opportunities, but a tightening snare. The Dominion's High Marshal Vrokov had finally understood the true nature of this fight. He had reshaped the battlefield to crush her under the weight of pure inevitability. If she ran, they would chase her down. If she hid, they would flush her out. The longer she fought like this, the more ground she lost. She needed to change the game. The enforcers weren't invincible. She had proven that already. They had weaknesses, and she had seen them. Unlike the average Dominion soldier, these things moved without hesitation, without fear, but that also meant they lacked restraint. They were programmed to pursue, to engage, to eliminate. They did not retreat. They did not reconsider. They committed fully to every attack. She could use that. She moved through the ruins of what had once been a Dominion command station, now little more than collapsed walls and exposed infrastructure. It was a graveyard of past victories, a place where previous defenders had made their last stands. The Dominion thought of it as little more than a forgotten battlefield, stripped of all useful resources. But Alex saw something else. She ran calculations in her head, mapping out angles, distances, structural weaknesses. She had no explosives left, no heavy ordnance to reshape the terrain in her favor. But she had knowledge. She had an understanding of physics, of weight distribution, of material integrity. She set the trap. The enforcers found her within minutes. Their speed was terrifying, their coordination seamless. They did not hesitate. They did not falter. They did exactly what she had expected them to do. They pursued. She led them deeper into the ruins, forcing them into narrow pathways, into places where they had to move in single file. Their advantage had always been in their ability to attack together, overwhelming their targets through sheer mechanical efficiency. Here they were forced into a bottleneck, their numbers meaningless. She moved with precision. Her shots weren't meant to kill, not immediately. They were meant to manipulate, to push them into position, to angle them toward the weak points she had identified. She forced them to adjust their approach, to jump where they normally would have ducked, to dodge in ways that altered their balance. Then she made her final move. The shot wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at the structure itself. The bullet struck an already unstable support beam, a carefully chosen weakness in the remains of a collapsed tower. The weight of the upper levels, barely held together by deteriorating material, gave way instantly. Tons of debris came crashing down in a controlled collapse, swallowing the enforcers beneath the wreckage. The dust settled. Silence followed. She waited, watched, monitored her sensors for movement. Nothing. She exhaled slowly, lowering her rifle. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But was a start. Vrokotha's mandibles twitched as he watched the live feed cut to static. The enforcers had failed. That was unacceptable. They had been the best the Dominion could offer, and yet this human had reduced them to nothing more than broken machinery buried under rubble. He turned, locking his gaze onto the officers who stood rigidly before him. None spoke. None dared. "This ends now," he growled. The Dominion had spent too long playing by the rules of war. It had followed doctrine, relied on its military superiority, assumed that sheer force would be enough. That arrogance had cost them. This was no longer an engagement. It was an infestation, and he would purge it. He issued new orders. There would be no more hunting, no more searching. The fortress itself would be reduced to ash. The moment she revealed herself again, every remaining artillery piece, every orbital cannon, every last ounce of firepower would be directed to a single purpose: her annihilation. The fortress became a killing ground. The Dominion turned its own stronghold into a self-destructive battlefield, sacrificing its own infrastructure just to eradicate one human. Alex adapted. Again. She had no choice. The Dominion was no longer fighting her. It was trying to erase her. Every move was met with overwhelming firepower, entire sections of the battlefield reduced to molten craters the moment she was spotted. There was no more cover, no more high ground. She was being suffocated. But that meant Vrokoth was desperate. She turned the strategy against them. If they wanted to destroy their own stronghold, she would let them. She moved with surgical precision, revealing herself just long enough to trigger their retaliation, then vanishing before the firepower struck. She made them waste their own resources, made them tear down their own walls. She forced them to dismantle their own fortress just to kill one woman. And when the Dominion had finally reduced its own stronghold to barely functioning ruins, when the last artillery strike had been fired and the command center itself was exposed to the chaos it had created, she struck. Vrokoth barely had time to react before she breached the command chamber. The Dominion's final stronghold had been hollowed out from the inside, its defenses stripped away, not by an army, but by its own hands. He reached for his weapon, but it was too late. Alex was already there. She didn't say anything. There were no words left to be spoken. The Dominion had called humanity cowards. It had believed strength was measured in numbers, in firepower, in sheer overwhelming force. But they had never understood what true strength was. It wasn't in numbers. It was in will. And Alex's will was unbreakable. The last thing Vrokoth saw was the flash of her rifle.